Hey friends, tonight we begin with Single Night Was Really Like in Medieval Europe. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you truly enjoy this kind of slow, calming storytelling. Your support means the world and helps me keep creating peaceful spaces like this one. Tell me now in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how this little quiet corner of the internet brings together people from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some soft background, and let's gently into tonight's journey together. The last rays of the sun were fading over the rooftops of a small medieval European town. The timbered houses, their upper floors jutting over narrow cobbled streets, caught the amber light as though they were holding on to the day for just a few moments more. The air carried the scent of wood smoke, drifting lazily from hearths that had been stoked in preparation for the long evening ahead. In the marketplace, the day's bustle was ebbing away. Merchants folded the corners of their linen awnings and packed away baskets of dried fish, bolts of coarse wool, and the last loaves of bread that had not been sold. The shouts that had filled the square through the afternoon softened to murmurs as traders counted coins by the light of the setting sun. A lone cart, its wooden wheels groaning under the weight of a barrel of ale, trundled toward a tavern near the edge of town, the driver urging his mule with a slow cluck of the tongue. Chickens scattered along the street as townsfolk made their way home, carrying bundles of kindling or the day's purchases wrapped in cloth. A woman in a rough woolen gown walked with her son, the boy clutching a small clay pot filled with fresh milk. At the edge of the square, a blacksmith, his face streaked with soot, closed the shutters of his forge and hung his hammer on a peg beside the door. The clang of his work faded into the evening stillness as the sky deepened into shades of indigo. The first candles and rushlights flickered to life in windows. In wealthier households, beeswax candles cast a warm, steady glow, their scent faint, but sweet. In humbler homes, tallow candles burned with a wavering flame and a faint smell of animal fat. The light, no matter its source, was precious, for candles and oil were costly, and their use was measured with care. Many families allowed the darkness to claim most of their rooms, gathering instead in a single space for the night's activities. From the church tower, a bell rang the evening call. Its deep, resonant tone rolled across the rooftops and down the winding lanes, marking the transition from day to night. For some, it was the signal to retreat indoors and secure doors and shutters against the cold and the unknown of the dark. For others, it marked the time to begin their night's labor, bakers kneading dough for the morning's bread, night watchmen starting their rounds, and servants preparing for the next day in the kitchens of the manor house. Beyond the town walls, the fields lay in shadow. The silhouettes of hayricks and bare winter trees stood against the fading sky. In the distance, the faint outline of a forest was visible, a dark mass from which the occasional hoot of an owl could be heard. Travelers who had not reached the safety of the gates by now would be making camp along the road or seeking shelter. In the nearest roadside inn, the dangers of the night wild animals, thieves, or the biting cold were reason enough to avoid the open countryside after sunset within the town. Narrow alleys and covered passages grew dim, their flagstones slick with the damp of the evening air. Rats emerged from the shadows to forage among refuse, their claws scratching faintly on stone. The watchman's lantern glowed faintly in the distance as he moved from street to street, pausing to check that doors were bolted and that no suspicious figures lingered. His pace was unhurried, his task as much about presence as about action. The Tavern doors opened to the sound of laughter and the smell of roasted meat. Inside, the room was lit by a few oil lamps and the fire in the hearth. Farmers who had come into town for market day shared mugs of ale with traveling peddlers, exchanging news of the road. The low hum of conversation was punctuated by the occasional burst of song. For many, the tavern was the center of the town's social life after dark, a place where warmth, light, and companionship could be found. Farther up the hill, in the manor house, the great hall glowed with firelight. Servants moved quietly about, carrying trenchers of food to the high table where the lord and his family sat. The meal was hearty but plain, with bread, cheese, pottage, and a joint of roasted meat at its center. Conversation was subdued, for the day's business had been tiring, and the weight of winter still lingered in the air. Beyond the high table, lesser retainers and servants ate at long trestle tables. The sounds of their chatter mixing with the crackle of the fire dot in the poorer quarters near the edge of town. Homes were small and tightly packed, their walls leaning slightly from years of wear. Here, the evening meal might be nothing more than bread and onions, perhaps a bit of salted pork if fortune allowed. Families huddled close to the hearth, sharing stories or mending clothing by the light of a single candle. Outside, the dirt. Lanes were nearly silent except for the distant barking of a dog. The night was still deepening, but the town was already shifting into the slow rhythm that would carry it until dawn. The day's noise had given way to quieter sounds, the creak of timbers in the cold, the faint crackle of fires, and the soft shuffle of feet on stone as the last stragglers found their way indoors. Above, the first stars pricked the sky, pale. Against the lingering blue dot it was, in these moments, between the day's labor and the deep night, that the town seemed to hold its breath. The streets, once filled with trade and talk, now belonged to the quiet watch of the night and the people. Within their homes turned toward the comfort of rest, knowing that the cycle would begin again when the morning bell called them to rise. As the evening deepened, the sky shifted from a muted blue to the darker shades of night, and the first breath of cold settled over the town. The warmth of the day had long since retreated, leaving the air crisp and damp. Stone walls, having absorbed the sun's heat, now released it slowly, creating a faint warmth along the narrow lanes. But this comfort faded quickly in the open spaces of the market square or along the bare stretches of road between houses in the center of town. The church stood as a silent guardian. Its tall spire cut a sharp silhouette against the darkening sky, and the faint light from within illuminated the stained glass from behind, casting soft patches of color onto the damp cobbles outside. A single priest lingered near the doorway, speaking in hushed tones to a parishioner who had come seeking advice or confession. Their silhouettes shifted gently in the flickering lamplight, their breath visible in the cold air. The marketplace, which only hours before had been a swirl of movement and noise, now lay in relative stillness. Empty stalls stood like sentinels, their wooden frames creaking softly in the breeze. A stray dog nosed at the remnants of the day's trade-discarded vegetable leaves. Crumbs of bread, a fish head left behind by a hurried vendor. The dog's movements were quick and purposeful, for it knew the night belonged to creatures that hunted in silence. From one narrow alley, a faint glimmer of light spilled out from a small workshop where a cobbler worked late into the night. His hands, rough and weathered, moved with steady precision as he stitched the leather of a worn boot. The glow of his oil lamp painted the walls in a soft amber, and the sound of his work the pull of thread, the quiet thump of the oars, just audible from the street. Outside his door, the air was quiet except for the soft rustle of a rat slipping into a gap between stones. In the wealthier quarter, houses of stone and timber stood more widely spaced, with walled gardens and carved doorways. Here, the sound of music drifted faintly from behind shuttered windows, the strings of a lute accompanied by a woman's gentle voice. The notes were slow and deliberate, weaving into the night like threads of gold through a dark cloth. A passing watchman paused for a moment to listen before resuming his slow circuit. His steps were heavy and measured, and the light from his lantern swung in a small arc, casting brief, moving shadows on the walls. Elsewhere, life was still awake in the tavern. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of smoke, ale, and stewing. Meat. The fire snapped sharply, sending sparks upward into the hooded chimney. A group of men, flushed from drink, leaned together over a game of dice, their laughter rising and falling in bursts. At a nearby table, an old man sat alone, slowly working through a wooden bowl of pottage, his eyes fixed on the flames as though they held the memory of a long-forgotten story. The room was close and warm, the kind of place where time slowed, and the outside world could be kept at bay, beyond the tavern. In the more hidden corners of the town, a different sort of business took place. In the shadowed recess of a lane, a figure in a cloak stood speaking to another, their faces obscured by the dimness. The exchange was brief, a small pouch changing hands before they moved off in opposite directions. Such dealings were not uncommon. In the night hours, when fewer eyes were watching, the sound of the church bell marked the passing of another hour. Its toll was deep and steady, rolling through the town like the slow turning of an unseen wheel. For many, it was the signal to close the shutters tighter, to bank the fire for the night, and to draw blankets close. In the poorer quarters, some homes had no candles to burn, and darkness claimed their rooms entirely once the fire's glow had faded. Here, people slept in close quarters for warmth, often in the same bed, the air heavy with the mingled scents of wool, smoke, and the day's labor. Outside the town walls, the world was even quieter. The wind moved through the fields, bending the dry grasses and rattling the wooden gates. The roads, empty now, were silvered by the faint light of the moon which had risen above the horizon. From the forest came the rustle of small creatures, moving in the undergrowth, and somewhere in the distance, the lonely howl of a wolf carried through the night. The town itself seemed to shrink inward, its life drawn into the pockets of warmth and light within its walls. The streets were left to the watchman, the stray animals, and the occasional traveler granted late entry. The stillness was not absolute. There were always quiet movements in the shadows, but it was a stillness that belonged to the medieval night, a kind of slow breathing of stone and timber, fire and frost. The further into the night the town drifted, the more it seemed to gather its secrets close. A faint mist had begun to rise from the damp earth, curling along the streets and softening the edges of the stone buildings. Lantern lights spilled out, in small pools from doorways and shutter cracks. But much of the town lay under a heavy cloak of shadow in the central square. The last embers of the communal fire still glowed faintly, a reminder of the gatherings that had taken place earlier. In the evening, now only a single figure remained near a beggar who sat hunched beneath a threadbare cloak, hands outstretched toward the dying warmth. He muttered softly to himself, the words lost to the cool air. From time to time, he reached into a small cloth bundle to retrieve a crust of bread, chewing slowly as though making it last as long as possible. Along the main street, a narrow ribbon of torchlight marked the passage of the night watch. Their boots rang faintly on the cobbles, and their low voices carried just far enough to let others know they were there. They stopped now and then to peer into darkened alleys, tapping doors with the ends of their staves to check that they were barred. It was a slow, methodical patrol, meant as much to reassure the townsfolk as to deter trouble. Behind the closed doors of the guild hall, a small meeting continued by the light of tallow candles. The men seated around the table spoke in measured tones, discussing matters of trade and disputes among craftsmen. The air was heavy with the scent of beeswax and parchment, and the table was littered with ink pots and sheets covered in neat lines of script. Outside, the muffled voices faded quickly into the night stillness. In the poorer lanes, the houses leaned toward each other as though for comfort, their upper stories nearly touching above the street. Here, the only light came from the occasional open hearth glimpsed through warped shutters. Inside one such home, a mother rocked her infant by the fire, the quiet crackle of the flames matching the slow rhythm of her movements. A small pot hung over the embers, its contents simmering gently, sending out a thin ribbon of steam scented faintly of onions and herbs at the edge of town. The blacksmith's forge sat silent, its tools neatly arranged on the bench for the next day's work. The forge itself was still faintly warm, its coals covered to keep them alive until morning. Beyond the forge, the road wound out toward the open countryside, where a few scattered cottages stood with only the pale moonlight to touch their roofs. The fields beyond were rimed with frost, and the hedgerows were silent save for the occasional rustle of a bird settling more deeply into its roost. The tavern's noise had begun to quiet as the hour grew later. A few patrons still lingered, their heads bent together in quiet conversation, but the earlier rowdiness had given way to a softer murmur. The tavern keeper moved slowly between the tables, gathering empty cups and brushing crumbs from the wooden surfaces. In one corner, the old man who had been staring into the fire earlier now dozed in his chair, his chin resting on his chest. The lute that had provided music earlier lay silent on its stand, its strings catching a faint glint from the fire-elight from the castle keep on the hill. A single light burned high in the tower. Inside, a scribe bent over his work, copying lines from a worn manuscript, his quill scratched steadily against the parchment, the sound barely audible beneath the occasional sigh as he paused to stretch his cramped fingers. Below the guard, on duty, walked the length of the battlements, his lantern swinging, his eyes scanning the dark landscape beyond the walls. The view from here stretched far into the countryside, the fields and woods bathed in moonlight, their stillness broken only by the faint glimmer of a stream winding silver through the valley. As the night deepened, the town seemed to settle into a rhythm of slow breathing. Fires dimmed to embers, voices fell to whispers, and the spaces between sounds grew longer. The cobbles cooled beneath the night air, and frost began to form in the cracks between stones. The smell of wood smoke lingered, mingling with the faint scent of damp earth. For those awake, time seemed to stretch, the hours blending together in the quiet. For those asleep, the night passed unnoticed, a dark and dream-filled space between the labors of one day and the demands of the next. Outside, under the watch of moon and stars, the medieval town kept its vigil as it had done for centuries, bound by walls of stone and the unspoken rules of the night. The hour had grown late enough that even the few who lingered awake seemed to do so out of necessity rather than choice. The night was fully claimed by the stillness, and every sound that did rise into it felt deliberate, measured, almost ceremonial. In its slow pace, the moon had climbed high above the rooftops, shedding a cold light that touched the tops of chimneys and made the frost on roof tiles glisten faintly. The air was sharper now, and with each passing hour, a thin sheet of ice began to form along the edges of water barrels and in the shallow ruts of the road. Even the breath of the few watchmen on patrol came out in visible clouds, curling away, before fading into the darkness. In a narrow lane not far from the square, a baker worked in near silence. He had risen long before most would stir, kindling the oven and preparing the dough for the morning's bread. The smell of yeast and warm flour drifted slowly into the street, mixing with the cool night air. Inside, the baker moved with practiced motions, his hands shaping the loaves without need for thought. The only sound was the soft thump of dough against the wooden table and the occasional creak of the oven door. A little further along, a small chapel stood with its heavy wooden door slightly ajar. Inside, a single candle burned on the altar, its flame bending slightly in the faint draught. A lone figure knelt before it, murmuring prayers that no one else would hear. The light caught on the simple metal of the cross above the altar, making it glint briefly in the dimness. Outside, the chapel bell hung silent, waiting for the slow toll that would mark the coming of dawn beyond the town walls. The fields were empty but for the quiet rustle of hedgerows in the wind. A shepherd lay wrapped in a heavy cloak beside. His resting flock, the sheep huddled together for warmth. Overhead, the stars were clear and bright, their cold light undisturbed by the smoke or glow of the town. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, sharp and sudden, before falling silent again. Back within the town, the watchman paused at the edge of a small courtyard where a public well stood. The rope and bucket hung still, and frost had begun to settle on the stone lip. They lingered only a moment before moving on, their boots crunching softly over the uneven ground. Their route would take them along the base of the town wall, past the closed gates, and back toward the main street. It was a circuit they knew by heart, one they could walk in darkness without losing their way. The castle keep remained a steady presence above it all. Within its stone walls, the guard in the tower leaned against the battlement for a moment, letting his eyes adjust fully to the moonlit fields. From here, the town looked almost like a model, carved in miniature tiny roofs clustered together. Narrow streets winding between them, the square a pale patch in the center. He turned away only when the chill began to bite at his fingers, retreating to the small brazier near the tower door. In the farthest corner of the town, a stable boy stirred in the loft above the horses. He shifted the hay beneath him and pulled his blanket more tightly, listening to the faint sounds below, the quiet snort of a horse, the scrape of a hoof against the floor. The animals, sensing no threat, were already half asleep, their breath rising in slow, steady clouds into the cold air. The night was now at its deepest. Even the tavern had gone still, its door barred, its fire reduced to a faint glow in the ashes. Somewhere in the town, a shutter creaked on its hinge, moved by a light breeze. The sound echoed briefly through the narrow streets before fading into the broader hush. It was a time when the town seemed most itself, not bustling or loud, but a place of ordered silence. Each building and street in its place, the patterns of life and rest shaped by centuries of habit. In these hours, the divisions between rich and poor, merchant and laborer, guard and traveler, blurred into the shared act of sleeping through the dark until morning. And so, the medieval night, with all its quiet watchfulness and still routines. passed on toward its slow and inevitable surrender to the first pale signs of dawn. The stillness of the night was now complete. Every sound that arose seemed amplified against the quiet. The faint creak of a beam inside a sleeping house, the muffled scuff of boots on frost-hardened ground, the distant, lonely call of an owl. In the streets, even the moonlight felt heavy, settling over the rooftops in pale, unbroken pools. Somewhere deep within the walled heart of the town, the last ember in a hearth winked out. The room it had warmed grew darker, but the heavy quilts and wool blankets held their warmth. In the loft above, a child stirred in his sleep, turning once before settling again, the sound of his breathing soft and steady. A carved wooden toy, a knight with a painted shield, lay on the floor beside the bed, forgotten until morning. In a larger house, closer to the square, a candle still burned in an upstairs chamber. The light was not a mark of sleeplessness, but of duty. A scribe sat at his desk, hunched over parchment, the quill in his hand whispering as it moved. He worked by the slow, deliberate rhythm of ink and blotting sand, pausing only to stretch his cramped fingers. His work, a record of the week's trade agreements, had to be ready for review at sunrise. The only other movement in the room came from a small brass clock on the mantel, its pendulum swaying in patient arcs. Outside, the watchmen continued their rounds. Their lanterns cast warm circles on the stone walls, revealing the occasional frost-ruined shutter or the worn grain of a wooden door. At intervals, they stopped to listen, not for a particular sound, but for the absence of one. Trouble had a way of announcing itself in the night. An unusual footstep, a hurried whisper, the rattle of a latch. On this night, there was nothing, and that nothing was a kind of comfort. In the poorer quarter, the homes were simpler. Their walls of timber and wattle, letting in the cold, despite the efforts of hearth and blanket. The families inside slept. In close quarters, their breathing and body heat shared. In one house, the low sound of snoring filled the small room, rising and falling like a slow tide. In another, a mother lay awake, not from worry but from habit, her eyes adjusting to the shapes in the dimness. She listened to the soft movements of her children beside her, and in the quiet, she could almost hear the frost settling outside. Beyond the walls, in the fields, and along the frozen riverbank, the land lay bare and watchful. The ice along the edges of the water reflected the moonlight, broken only where a thin stream trickled over stones. A fox padded silently along the river's edge, pausing to lift its head toward the town before disappearing into the hedgerow. The hours before dawn were the most secret part of the night, the time when the world seemed to shrink to only those who kept watch, worked by necessity, or wandered sleepless under the stars. For most, these hours passed unnoticed, folded into dreams and forgotten upon waking. But for those who lived them awake, they were a slow, deliberate passage of time. Each moment measured in breath, in footstep, in the slow turning of the stars. Overhead, the scribe, still bent over his parchment, did not notice the faint paling of the sky beyond his shuttered window. The baker, already in his shop, was beginning to hear the quiet hiss and crackle of the oven as it warmed, and somewhere in the castle, a guard leaned over the battlements to see the faintest suggestion of dawn pressing at the edge of the horizon. The night was not yet over, but its deepest hold was loosening. The change was subtle, a softening of shadows, a gentler tone in the air. But for those awake to see it, it was enough to mark the slow passing of one world into the next. The night's stillness had begun to change in ways that only the wakeful could notice. The air was no warmer, but there was a different quality to it, less like the deep, breathless silence of midnight, and more like a gentle pause before something begins. In the bakery, the first batch of loaves was now in the oven, their crusts slowly taking shape. The baker moved between the table and the hearth in steady rhythm, shaping more dough while glancing at the rising bread. A faint, golden glow from the open oven door spilled into the darkened street outside whenever he bent to check it. That warm light, paired with the smell of baking, was a silent announcement that morning was coming. A few streets away, a man with a wooden cart moved quietly over the cobbles. His cart carried bundles of firewood, which he would leave outside. Certain doors before the day began in earnest. He knew each turn of the road, each uneven patch where the wheels might catch. His breath formed clouds in the cold air, fading quickly as he went about his work at the public well. The first to arrive was a woman wrapped in a thick wool cloak, a wooden bucket swinging from her hand. The sky was still dark, but she preferred to draw water before others came. The bucket splashed as it touched the surface far below, and the rope groaned softly as she hauled it up. The water was shockingly cold, carrying the bite of the night with it. She poured it carefully into a clay jar and set off toward home without looking back in the castle courtyard. The guard on the gate exchanged a few quiet words with the one coming to relieve him. There was no ceremony to the change, just a nod, a brief exchange of the watchman's lantern, and each man going to his appointed place. From the gatehouse, the road beyond the walls was still empty, a pale thread disappearing into the frost-covered countryside. On the edge of town, in a low stone building that smelled faintly of hay and smoke, a farrier was already at work. He worked by lamplight, the metal tools on his bench gleaming faintly. A horse stood patiently in the stall beside him, its breath visible in the cold air. The farrier's hammer struck with a measured, deliberate rhythm, a sound that carried softly into the street outside. Still, the town was more asleep than awake. Most windows remained shuttered, and the fires in the hearths burned low. The few awake moved through streets where their footsteps seemed to belong to another world, a place held between night and day, where the rules of the waking hours had not yet begun. A faint line of light was now appearing along the horizon, too subtle to illuminate anything but enough to tell those who saw it that the night's reign was waning. Even so, the stars above still shone bright, refusing to yield just yet. The town, cradled in its walls and surrounded by fields, lay in a kind of suspended breath, caught between the peace of the night and the inevitable stir of the day to come. The first cockcrow came from somewhere beyond the town walls, its sharp call breaking the fragile veil of night. It was answered moments later by another, closer this time, and then another, until the sound seemed to ripple across the countryside. For those still asleep, it was only part of the dream. For those already awake, it was the signal that the night's quiet was beginning to fade. In the market square, a pair of traders arrived early, leading small donkeys laden with goods. Their breath came in short, clouded puffs, and the muffled jingle of harness buckles carried softly in the cold air. They spoke little, their footsteps echoing faintly as they crossed the empty square toward the covered stalls. The frost on the wooden benches caught what little light the horizon offered, glimmering like dusted glass. Elsewhere, a window creaked open on its leather hinges. An elderly man leaned out, rubbing his eyes as he looked over the street below. He pulled his cloak tighter around him, inhaling the faint smoke of chimney fires beginning to stir back to life. From somewhere down the lane came the rhythmic scrape of a broom on cobblestones. A shopkeeper sweeping away leaves and bits of straw from the front of his door, near the stables. A stable hand moved from stall to stall, offering hay and grain. To the restless animals, horses nickered softly, their ears flicking forward at the sound of the feed buckets. The smell of hay mingled with the cold temps of morning air, and the faint clatter of wooden buckets echoed against the stable's stone walls. A baker's boy appeared in the lane, carrying a tray of small loaves wrapped in cloth. He moved quickly, the steam rising from the bread trailing behind him. Each stop was brief, a knock, a quiet word, the exchange of bread for coin or token, before he disappeared. Again, into the dim morning light, the sound of metal striking metal began to ring faintly from the far end of the street. The blacksmith was not yet at full work, but he was shaping nails and fittings in preparation for the day's repairs. His hammer rose and fell with an unhurried rhythm, each strike carrying a low, resonant tone through the still quiet streets. A faint hum of life was returning to the town, not as a sudden rush, but as a gradual weaving together of sound and movement. Footsteps here, a voice there, the shifting of shutters, the slow build of fires. The silence of the night was loosening its hold, replaced by the small, steady activities that marked the start of another day. Above it all, the church bell gave a slow, single chime, not to call the townspeople yet, but to mark the hour. Its deep note rolled through the streets and over the rooftops, mingling with the first light that now began to catch the edges of the higher buildings. The town was not fully awake, but the night was no longer its own. The faint grey of the horizon had deepened into a pale, steady light. Shadows were no longer long streaks across the cobblestones, but soft pools fading at the edges. The last stars still hung overhead, stubborn in their places, yet their brightness had dulled against the rising day from the church tower. The bell began to toll the morning hour, this time with the clear, deliberate sequence that called the devout to prayer. The sound rolled over rooftops and down alleys, past the market square and the open gates, until even the farmers in the fields beyond the walls could hear it. Doors opened with the groan of wooden hinges, and voices now spoke more freely in the streets. A group of women with baskets on their arms headed toward the well, their cloaks brushing against the frost that still clung to the lower edges of walls. They spoke in low voices, pausing only to step aside for a man driving a cart piled high with sacks of grain toward the mill. The air smelled of change, of smoke thickening from newly stoked hearths, of bread baking in earnest now, of damp, earth beginning to release the cold it had held through the night. It was still winter's breath that lingered in the shadows, but with the light came the suggestion of warmth. Faint though it was, in the market the traders' stalls were no longer empty. Bolts of coarse cloth were being unrolled and folded, baskets of apples set neatly in rows, and jars of honey placed where the sun would catch their golden glow. The sound of metal weights clinking in small brass scales joined the low murmur of voices setting prices for the day's trade. At the smithy, the forge was now fully lit. The glow spilled out into the lane as the blacksmith worked, each strike of his hammer ringing sharp and sure. Sparks leaped and vanished before touching the ground. Passers-by glanced in as they went about their errands, some pausing for a brief word with the man at his anvil. The town's main gate saw its first small procession of the day. A farmer, leading a pair of goats, a peddler balancing a yoke of goods across his shoulders, a youth carrying a bundle of kindling, The watchman at the gate nodded them through without question, his eyes scanning the road beyond for anything unusual. Now, the sky above the rooftops was pale gold near the horizon and a washed blue overhead. The night's long hold had ended without protest, melting into the steady pulse of another day. What had been quiet, still, and shrouded in shadow only an hour ago was now alive with movement, each sound and sight building into the tapestry of medieval life. The night had passed, as it always did, leaving behind only its memory in the cold stones, the faint traces of frost, and the stories that might be told by those who had moved through its silent hours. Just past the heavy timber gates, the road stretched out into the open countryside, its ruts frozen hard from days of cold. The air here was sharper, untouched by the mingled scents of the town. Only the faint aroma of distant wood smoke carried. Across the fields, a reminder that small cottages and farmsteads dotted the land beyond sight by the roadside. Bare trees stood against the faint glow of the horizon, their black branches fine as lace against the sky. The wind was gentler here, its sound carrying a low whistle through the hedgerows and across the open meadows. Frost clung thick to the grass, and each step crunched softly underfoot. Farther along, the first of the farmhouses came into view, a squat building of timber and daub, its thatched roof dusted white. A pale column of smoke curled from the chimney, drifting lazily upward in the still morning air. Beside it, a small barn leaned slightly to one side, its door ajar enough to reveal the shapes of livestock stirring inside in the pen closest to the road. A farmer moved slowly, spreading feed for his hens. His breath clouded before him as he worked, and the quiet clucking of the birds was the only sound for some distance. Now and then, one of the hens flapped its wings and sent a scatter of frost from the fence rails into the air. Across the lane, a shepherd was guiding his small flock toward a patch of grass that caught the first light of day. The sheep moved reluctantly, their coats heavy with dew. The shepherd's crook tapped the ground as he walked, and his dog trotted ahead, occasionally circling back to keep stragglers in line. Further down the road, a small wooden chapel stood. On a rise, its bell tower no taller than the nearby trees. The sound of its morning bell was lighter than that of the great church in the town, a soft chime that seemed to blend with the wind. A lone figure climbed the slope toward its door, the hem of a cloak trailing across the frost dot. Here in the countryside, the pace was slower, the signs of life more scattered. The night had released its hold, but the day had not yet fully claimed. The land, each cottage, each barn, each low plume of smoke, felt like its own small island in the wide, cold expanse. Beyond the hedgerows, the road wound on, curving toward places, still hidden from sight, where the night might still linger in. Shadows untouched by the sun. The road narrowed as it dipped into a shallow valley, the hedgerows closing in until the view ahead was framed in dark, tangled branches. Here, the sun's first light was slow to arrive, and the air felt colder, as though the night had chosen to remain a little longer in this low ground. The hamlet emerged gradually from the shadows, a cluster of a dozen cottages, huddled together around a small central green. The roofs were thick with thatch, their edges hanging low enough to brush the tops of the shutters. A thin mist clung to the earth, pooling between the houses, curling around the legs of those who walked through it. A single fire burned in the middle of the green, its smoke rising in a wavering column. Around it, two men stood with their cloaks pulled tightly around them, speaking in hushed tones as they warmed their hands. Every so often, one would step away to check the low gate. At the edge of the hamlet, where the road continued on, the sound of a door creaking open broke the stillness. An older woman emerged from one of the cottages, balancing a clay jug in the crook of her arm. She crossed to the fire, nodded to the men, and continued toward the small well on the far side of the green. The water's surface was still and dark, reflecting the faint gleam of the sky above. Nearby, a boy sat on a wooden stool, mending the leather strap of a bucket. His hands moved slowly, careful with each stitch, as though this quiet hour was a time to work without haste. From inside the cottages came muffled sounds. The scrape of a bench, the soft clink of pottery, the low murmur of voices preparing for the day ahead. A dog trotted across the green, its breath steaming in the cold. It paused to look toward the road, ears pricked, before padding back to sit by the fire. One of the men reached down to scratch its head absently, eyes still on the shadows beyond the gate, in the fields beyond the hamlet. Faint shapes moved, perhaps a pair of travelers, their cloaks drawn up, hurrying toward the warmth and safety of the clustered houses. The night had not been dangerous here, not tonight, but the habit of vigilance was one the countryside did not easily forget. The mist began to thin as the light grew stronger, but in the hollows between cottages, the night seemed to linger still, unwilling to leave entirely until the sun had touched every roof and path. Beyond the hamlet, the road narrowed further, becoming little more than a rutted track with grass growing in its center. Frost still clung here, untouched by hooves or cartwheels since the night before. Ahead, a low wall of trees marked the boundary between the open farmland and the forest beyond. The first trees stood apart from each other, their trunks silver with cold, but as the track wound deeper, the growth thickened. Branches tangled overhead, turning the light pale and thin. The forest floor was dark, with patches of leaf litter damp from the night's frost. The air here smelled of earth and pine, and each breath felt cooler, as though the shadows themselves were holding on to the chill. A small watchfire smoldered at the edge of a clearing, its orange glow just visible between the trees. Two figures sat beside it, their hoods drawn low. They were travelers, judging by the bundles resting against the roots of a nearby oak. One poked at the embers with a stick, coaxing a little more heat from the coals, while the other sipped from a leather flask. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a woodcutter's axe rang out, slow and deliberate. The sound echoed between the trunks, carrying far in the still morning air. A moment later came the muffled thud of a tree settling into its fall, followed by the soft sigh of branches brushing the ground. Birdsong began hesitantly, a few notes from a hidden perch, answered by another from farther away. With each passing minute, the forest seemed to breathe more deeply, the life within it stirring as the day took hold. At the base of a moss-covered stone, a lone pilgrim knelt in prayer. His cloak pooled around him, and the small wooden cross hanging from his neck swung gently in the breeze. He whispered words into the cold air, his breath turning them into brief clouds before they vanished. The track curved sharply, and the forest thinned enough to reveal a distant ridge where the first true sunlight poured over the land. From here, the view stretched to where the fields resumed, broken by hedgerows and dotted with smoke from unseen hearths. Yet behind, in the deeper reaches of the forest, the night seemed to linger, a low, patient presence, not easily moved by the changing of the sky. Those who traveled here alone often quickened their pace, eager to reach the open ground before the light faded again. The track emerged from the shadow of the woods into a wide clearing. Here, The land opened in a sweep of pale grass and frost-stiffened earth, and in the center stood a lone farmstead. Its thatched roof was rimmed with white, the frost melting. Only where thin threads of smoke rose from the chimney. A low stone wall circled the property, patched with timber in places where the stones had tumbled. Inside the enclosure, a pair of cattle stood motionless, their breath streaming in the cold morning air. One shifted its weight and sent a soft cloud of hay dust floating in the sunlight, near the farmhouse door. A man in a wool tunic stooped to gather split logs from a pile. His hands moved with practiced slowness, stacking each one against the wall. Every so often, he paused to rub his palms together and blow on his fingers before continuing from the open barn. The faint sounds of movement carried out the shuffle of hooves, the rustle of hay, and the low hum of someone speaking to the animals. A woman stepped into view, a pail in each hand, the hem of her skirt brushing the frozen earth. She crossed to the farmhouse, her steps steady despite the weight she carried. A cart stood nearby, its wheels rimmed with frost. The traces for the horse lay neatly coiled, ready for the day's work. Beyond it, a narrow path cut across the clearing toward the fields, its edges lined with frost-tipped grass. The sunlight reached it now, spilling across the ruts and turning the frozen surface into a scatter of tiny geolint. In the distance, the forest loomed, dark and still. But here in the open, the air felt lighter. The sounds of the morning, a rooster calling from somewhere out of sight, the soft creak of wood as the farmhouse door swung open. The muffled crackle of the hearth inside marked the slow shift from night into day. This was a place where the night left quietly, almost unnoticed, slipping away in the space between simple chores and the first warmth of the sun on the walls. The road curved gently, following the line of a shallow stream. Along its banks, frost-cloaked reeds swayed faintly, their tips catching the pale gold of the rising sun. The water moved slowly, its surface thinly veiled by mist that clung to the current as if reluctant to leave. Ahead, the rooftops of a larger village began to appear. They rose in uneven lines, some sharply pitched, others sagging with age, each crowned with a thatch of pale straw or wooden shingles darkened by the years. Thin threads of smoke wound upward from chimneys, tracing the morning air with the scent of oak and peat. At the village edge, the first signs of life were stirring. A young boy led a shaggy donkey along the path, the animal's hooves striking the frosted ground with a muted thud. A pair of geese waddled toward the stream, hissing softly as they passed, their breath puffing in quick bursts past further in. The narrow lanes were still dim, the tall timbered houses leaning toward each other and casting long shadows. In one doorway, an elderly man sat on a low stool, wrapping twine around a bundle of kindling. His fingers moved methodically, each knot tightened with the ease of long practice. The tavern door creaked open, and a yawning figure stepped into the lane, pulling a cloak around his shoulders. He paused to stretch, glanced toward the pale sky, and then disappeared back inside. From somewhere within, the faint clatter of wooden mugs echoed, followed by a low voice humming a tune without words. A single bell sounded from the far end of the village, its tone clear and measured. It marked neither alarm nor ceremony, simply the hour, a reminder that another day had begun. The sound carried across the rooftops and drifted into the surrounding fields, mingling with the quiet breath of the morning. The air was still cool, enough to bite at the skin, but with each moment, the sunlight pressed further into the lanes, filling them with a steady glow. Night was gone now, yet its presence lingered in the stillness that clung to the corners and alleys where the day had not yet fully arrived. The village square was still half-shadowed when the first merchants arrived. A pair of carts rolled in from opposite lanes, their wheels creaking over the uneven stones. The drivers exchanged quiet nods, the sort that belonged to people who had met here every morning for years. At the center of the square stood the market cross, its base worn smooth by centuries of feet, its stone pale where frost had settled. A small wooden table leaned against its side, already bearing a folded cloth and a few baskets waiting to be filled. A baker's apprentice hurried across the square, arms full of loaves wrapped in coarse linen. Steam curled from the bread, carrying the scent of yeast and warm crust into the cool air. He ducked into a side door, and a moment later the sound of a latch clicking echoed faintly nearby. A cooper was setting out small barrels, the metal hoops clinking softly as he placed them in neat rows. His breath rose in short bursts, and the sleeves of his tunic were rolled to his elbows despite the chill. A stray dog trotted between the carts, sniffing at the ground before settling near the base of the market cross. It curled into a tight bowl, nose tucked beneath its tail, content to wait for whatever scraps the day might bring. From one of the upper windows overlooking the square, a woman shook out a woolen blanket. She paused to look down at the growing activity, then withdrew, leaving the shutters slightly ajar so the morning light could spill inside. A slow rhythm began to build, the shuffle of boots on stone, the thud of crates being set down, the low hum of conversation. It was not yet the bustling market of midday, but the shape of it was forming, like a painting slowly taking on color. The shadows crept back as the sun climbed higher, glinting off the damp cobblestones where night's frost was melting away. In these moments, the square felt suspended, not quite of the night, not yet of the day, but resting briefly in the gentle balance between the two. By mid-morning, the square had warmed enough for the frost to vanish from the rooftops. Water dripped from the eaves in slow, steady drops, falling into the mud-softened street below. The damp air carried a mingled scent of fresh bread, damp wool, and the faint tang of smoke that still hung in pockets between the houses. Merchants now stood behind their stalls, arranging goods with a practiced eye. A fishmonger laid out his catch atop beds of damp rushes, the scales glistening in the sunlight. He called out his prices in a voice that carried easily across the square, drawing the first customers of the day near him. A woman selling dyed cloth smoothed each fold, the colors bright against the weathered wood of her table. The reds and blues caught the morning light, glowing faintly against the pale backdrop of the surrounding buildings. Children darted between the legs of the crowd, some chasing each other, others sent on errands with small coins clutched tightly in their fists. Their laughter rang out, a bright counterpoint to the measured tones of haggling. A pair of traveling merchants arrived, leading pack mules laden with goods. Dust clung to their boots and cloaks, and one paused to wipe his brow before joining the growing knot of people at the cooper's stall. Their voices carried the accents of a distant region, adding a touch of the wider world to the familiar rhythm of the village morning. At the far side of the square, an old man sat on a bench with a wooden cup in his hands. He watched the scene, quietly nodding now and then to those who passed. Behind him, the tavern's door stood open, letting the sound of a lute drift into the open air. The sunlight now lay full across the cobblestones, leaving no corner untouched. Shadows still lingered, but they were no longer the deep, still shapes of night. They were lightened and softened belonging to a day in motion rather than a night at rest. With each passing minute, the stillness that had clung since dusk, the previous evening, seemed further away, replaced by the layered voices, scents, and movements of life in its daily flow. By the time the sun was high enough to gleam off the weathered iron of the church bell, the last trace of the night had gone. The village square was alive now, every stall occupied, every lane carrying the sound of footsteps. What had begun in the quiet hush of moonlight had transformed into the full, layered hum of a medieval day. The baker's loaves were nearly sold, their scent fading as the last few cooled in the open air. The fishmonger's voice had grown rough from hours of calling, though his smile remained for each new customer. The cooper leaned on his stall, sharing a joke with a passing farmer, while a dog at his feet gnawed on a discarded bone. Somewhere above, laundry flapped in the breeze, strips of white linen and wool dyed in earth tones, catching the sunlight as they swayed. A small bird hopped along the line, unbothered by the noise below. The road leading out of the village had already seen its first travelers. A woman with a basket over her arm walked briskly toward the next hamlet, her shawl drawn tight against the morning wind. Behind her, a cart creaked away in the opposite direction, its load covered with a woolen cloth to keep it dry should the weather turn. And yet, for all the motion, there was a quiet thread that ran beneath it, the memory of the night just past, the cool damp of the air before dawn, the way the frost clung to rooftops, the distant echo of footsteps on stone in the hours when the world slept. It was a memory that would fade with the day's business, but for now it lingered in the mind like the final verse of a song. Night in medieval. Europe was never truly silent, nor entirely still, but it held a kind of rhythm all its own, a slow pulse that quickened only when the first light touched the earth. And as the day pressed forward, that rhythm slipped into the background, waiting to return with the setting sun. For those who lived it, the night was not just the absence of light. It was a world unto itself, with its own dangers, comforts, and small wonders. And for anyone standing here in this square, watching the daylight finally take hold, it was impossible not to feel that the night had been just as real, just as alive, as the day now replacing it.